All righty.
All right.
So, hello everyone. We are here today with Matthew Algeo, who is an author who has written numerous books on many interesting topics, from Harry Truman's post-presidency to the surgery of Grover Cleveland, and one that I was fascinated with, pedestrianism. So, if you'd like to just tell us a little bit about yourself and start off this conversation.
Sure, Cameron. Good to chat with you. So I write books mostly about U.S. history. My background was in journalism, and I worked as a reporter at public radio stations mostly. And then I guess it was about 15 or 16 years ago, my wife joined the U.S. Foreign Service. So we live overseas mostly. We move from place to place, and writing books is a fairly portable occupation. It's kind of something you can do anywhere. So it really worked out nicely that I could write these books. And so we go back to Washington, at least every 2 years for a while. And then I can do a lot of the research there. And then when we go to post, I can do most of the writing and then go back and hopefully promote the books when they come out. So it's been really fun. It's been really interesting, and it's a lot of fun. I really enjoy it.
So how did you start deciding, like, oh, you want to write books? Like, what was it that you saw and you were like, man, this story, it just needs to be told?
Actually, it was the first book I did. It started as a story that I did for NPR, and it was it was in 2003, and it was the, I guess, 60th reunion of the Steagles. Now, during World War II, the NFL was so short of players that they had to merge the Steelers and the Eagles, and they became the Steagles for a season. And so it was a really interesting team. All the guys who were on the team, of course, were not in the military. Actually, a couple of guys were in the military, but most of them were not able to be in the military. So they had some sort of problem, usually perforated eardrum or bleeding ulcers, things like that. So it was a really interesting story about these guys who weren't able to fight overseas, but really helped contribute on the home front by keeping people entertained. And they also worked in factories during the week. Obviously, the NFL was much different in 1943 than it is today. I mean, they were making, $200 a game if they were lucky. That was pretty good money. So I interviewed the guys who went to this reunion. I think 5 or 6 of them went to the reunion in Pittsburgh. It was before a Steelers-Eagles preseason game. And then just after I did the story, I thought there was so much more that could be told about it, about life on the home front during World War II, about the history of sports in America, really, and the history of the NFL. So I put together a proposal to write that book, and then it really worked out. The timing worked out really well because I got the contract to write that book just at the same time my wife started her work in the Foreign Service. So, we moved to Washington for a year. I was able to get a lot of research done, do more interviews. And then when we went overseas, I was able to write the book and finish it. So, and then after that, really, it's just stories that you find. It's hard to find good stories. And it's also hard to find stories that you're willing to live with for a long time. I always say it's sort of like, it's sort of like dating. You really got to like this person to make the commitment to, like, go to prom, and you can't get out of it once you decide you're going to do it. So
once you commit, you're there.
You're right, exactly. There's no backing out. Like, once you agree to do it, you got to do it. So you really better like the story. So it's important to find a story that is worth being told, and B, it's important to find a story that you are into enough that you're willing to live with it for a couple of years to do all the research and the writing.
So that is very interesting, because I know whenever I go through my process, I'll just be reading something like, oh, that's interesting, I want to talk about it, and then I'll go down the rabbit hole. So
right. And a lot of my books are like that, sort of going down different rabbit holes along the way. But you always have to remember, like, there's one focus here on this story, and you can't get too far away from that. You sometimes find, like, maybe it's I'm spending too much time researching things that aren't really directly related to the story, and I need to get back to the main story. So you have to be careful that you go down, all the rabbit holes, but don't get lost. You got to find your way back.
So now with that, the book mainly that I want to talk about in the research you've done is over Grover Cleveland. And most people, they just remember Cleveland as the really big guy who served two non-consecutive terms, but he's so much more than that. So whenever you started with Cleveland, what was it specifically that made you say, this is it, like this, people need to know about this?
Well, Grover's story is, excuse me, is really kind of incredible. He, in the space of 4 years from 1880 to 1884, rose from total obscurity to become mayor of Buffalo and then governor of New York and then president of the United States. So, really, in 4 years, he went from somebody nobody had ever heard of to president. And so that right away was interesting to me. And also, of course, the fact that he is the only president to run for reelection, lose, come back again, and then win the office back. But the story about that I talk about in the book, The President is a Sick Man, is about this operation that was performed on him at the beginning of his second term in 1893. And I kind of used the story of this secret cancer operation that was performed on a friend's boat to tell the story of Grover's life. So when you read the book, you go back to Buffalo in his early days, and he was born in New Jersey, and he moved to Buffalo and became a lawyer, and he was single, and he was a single guy who liked to drink beer and eat German food, and that's why he got so big. And then he really was kind of talked into running for mayor, and was so successful at that, the Democrats talked him into running for governor, and then they talked him into running for president. And the first time Grover Cleveland ever visited Washington, D.C. was when he showed up the day before his first inauguration. So it was really a very different kind of time. But
It's very
the story,
interesting.
yeah. He he didn't travel very much in really in his entire life. The story of the operation was actually something. I'm from Philadelphia.
Oh, my mother's from
and many
Philadelphia too.
All right. There's a great museum there. It's called the Mutter Museum, and it's a museum of medical history. And it sounds boring, but it's anything but boring because they have the most amazing stuff there. And one of the things they have on display there that I saw many years ago is the tumor that was removed from Grover Cleveland's mouth. And it's still there in a jar in some preserving fluid. And so I had known about this operation, and I started doing research about it, and was really surprised that there really hadn't been anything written about it, which kind of goes to show how good he was at keeping it a secret. It didn't really come out until many years later, after he was dead. One of the doctors finally told the full story. But so I'd always kind of known about the story of the operation, and then doing some research on Grover himself. I just thought the whole story was really kind of interesting.
Yeah. And he really is, because I was talking with someone the other night as I was kind of preparing for this interview, and he was like, "Oh, what is it about Grover Cleveland?" And I described that rise to power, and he kind of compared it to, President Barack Obama when he rose from a obscure state senator to, president of the United States over 4 years. That
Right.
Things like that just really don't happen as much. So it's
Yeah,
always
and
interesting.
I like to say that so Grover was elected the first time in 1884. So go back 4 years before that to the election of 1880, and nobody had ever heard of Grover Cleveland. And it's so unusual. Now, when we had the election, say in 2020, right? The next one's in 2024. Well, whoever's elected in 2024, we've heard their name. We know them. We
Yeah.
know who it's going to be. You could put a list of about 30 people, and one of them is going to be
It
president
will
of
be
2020.
the chances of it being a dark horse is so low that if it happened,
Yeah. You would never not know who is kind of looking to be president down the line. But Grover, 4 years before he was elected in 84. If you go back to 80, nobody outside of Buffalo really had ever heard of him. So there is an interesting parallel with Obama. Now, Obama was very ambitious. I think he, was kind of calculating in his career. And Grover, a little more things just kind of fell into his lap. He liked to say the stars aligned for him. I mean, he really got very lucky in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But you have to be lucky to get
Yeah.
elected president, I
And
guess.
that's the thing is like he never really actively campaigned. It always just kind of came to people like, well, we need somebody, and we don't like the other
Right,
people, but we do actually like this. Like he's a candidate who they brought up that people actually liked, not just because they hated the other guy, and that's also
right,
pretty
right.
rare.
Yeah, he made a lot of friends. I think he was very gregarious. I think he was very outgoing, and he was not the kind of guy you didn't like. I mean, he liked to have beer. He liked to eat German food. He lived in a boarding house in Buffalo. He was not very pretentious. He was not highly educated. He was a brilliant lawyer and a brilliant thinker, I think. But yeah, so a lot of the times it was really just like you said. It's sort of like, well, uh, everybody has reasons they don't like that guy, and they don't like that guy, but everybody kind of likes him, so let's go with him. And that was really kind of how he got nominated for the Democratic nomination in 1884. And it was a testament to his personality, I guess, that he was able to win the nomination that way.
It's always very interesting because these Gilded Age presidents get cast off as these less interesting figures of obscurity. But if you actually dig deep into it, starting with the first Gilded Age president, Grant, like that's the guy who won the Civil War, followed by a guy who had probably the most contentious election up until
Right.
2020. And then you've got
Right.
assassinations and ascendancies and so many interesting things that if you just take time to dig into, they're fascinating figures. But when you're not leading through a major war or some other major event with a really big thing, people tend to forget you. And
Yeah,
it's just sad.
that period for me was a huge gap in my understanding of history from end of the Civil War to between the Civil War and First World War. It's just sort of like, yeah, it's the Gilded Age. All these guys with beards were presidents. Nothing much really happened. And so we just sort of gloss over it. But you're right. Once you really look at what's going on, I think another problem with people appreciating, the presidents of the Gilded Age is that a lot of the issues that were hugely important back then to us now just seem kind of obscure, like gold
Mhm.
versus silver, monetary policy. What should American currency be based on? Should it be based on gold or silver or both? Bimetallism, gold bugs, silver rights. So a lot of that, the issues we just can't relate to a lot of the issues that were very important to people back then. But once you really get down and start really looking at them, and like you said, if you just go through the presidents, like every one of them really has kind of a crazy story from,
Mhm.
Grant and Hayes. Garfield gets assassinated. Chester Arthur, whoever expected him to be
Yeah,
president.
exactly.
And then like Cleveland comes along, and you get old Ben Harrison in there, even though Cleveland wins the popular vote in that
Yeah.
election, in 1888. But he loses in the Electoral College, comes back in 92. Then McKinley comes, and then of course Teddy comes in
So,
in '01 and sort of changes everything. But it is an interesting period in American history, but overlooked.
they're all very dynamic figures. And I know because I take a lot of American history classes, and we'll get to these periods and it'll be like, well, there were these things happen. It's like, hold on. It's like those are big things that are happening. Those are what we should be discussing. Like most people know the Monroe Doctrine and but when we're talking about like Grover Cleveland, the annexation of Hawaii, like that's a big
Right.
thing. Why did
Right.
Harrison decide to annex it? Why did Cleveland decide I'm not going to annex it, but I will recognize the new government? Like those are interesting
Right.
nuances that we need to understand
Right.
for American history.
And really the racial component too is just fascinating when you look at sort of segregation in the South getting entrenched. And then Plessy versus Ferguson. It comes in the 1890s. The dynamics of race relations in America are just sort of sifting out in ways that we're still kind of dealing with today in the aftermath.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's so fascinating, the things that people don't realize have an effect, because they think, oh, what happened in the past? It's like, exactly, it happened in the past. It's still affecting us. You know,
Right.
history does
Yeah.
not exist in a vacuum. It has long-reaching effects. You know,
Yeah. And
so,
we're, I mean, you know, in some ways, I think the the Civil War wasn't that long ago.
no,
And when you do the crazy things and think about, okay, well, Grover Cleveland, guess he died in 1907. I mean, you know, we've met plenty of people in our life when we were younger who were alive at the same time Grover Cleveland was alive. The last Civil War veterans didn't die until the 1940s
yeah,
and
the
50s. So,
1950s.
yeah. So, I mean, it's weird to think there were Civil War veterans, watching I Love Lucy. So
Exactly.
it really it's much closer. It's much closer than people appreciate.
One that I like to use to tell people is like, okay, so Cleveland was the 22nd president in 1884, and he spent most of his life in Buffalo. Well, there was another president from Buffalo who served from 50 to 53, Millard Fillmore. So I always have that wonder of, I wonder if they ever just ran into each other. And I haven't found anything about that, but it's so interesting to think about how those things collapse and interact with each
I
other.
think in yeah, I think in the Alan Nevins biography of Cleveland that he mentions, like, Cleveland was very young when he moved to Buffalo. He was still at late teens, I think. And I think he mentioned something in there that he had seen Fillmore go by in his carriage or something like that. Yeah, it's stuff like that. I just love stuff like that. And what was the other one I saw? There's a Reddit thread that talks about stuff like this, and there's something about overlapping lives, and
Yeah.
something like Eddie Van Halen and Albert Einstein were alive at the same
Yeah.
time.
And
Stuff
that's
like
hard
that.
to
Like, you just
imagine
don't.
sometimes,
Yeah.
because
You don't appreciate that. But yeah, so the scale really kind of shrinks when you start thinking of it in terms of generations, and it's all much closer.
I mean, I think even thinking like, my grandfather was born in 1917 in Philadelphia, right before the U.S., I think right after the U.S. entered World War One. It's like, that's not that far removed from Grover Cleveland. And
Right.
he remembered as a kid, President Harding dying. It's like, these things are, it's not that far as we like to think, and to
No,
kind of continue
it's incredible.
the discussion is that when Cleveland got back into office in 1893 and he had the surgery, he didn't tell his vice president, which is
No.
really a remarkable thing to do, And can you kind of explain and elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, it was interesting because we mentioned the big issue was gold versus silver. We don't need to get into that, but the short version of it is that the Eastern establishment bankers, financiers wanted gold to be what American currency was based on. People in the West, especially as new mining states came into the Union, Colorado, Nevada, Montana, Idaho, these states came in the 1870s and 1880s, and they were big silver states. So there was a lot of silver mines there. So they wanted silver to be what the currency was based on. Of course, now our currency is really not based on anything, but at the time you could have $1 in gold and go say, I want $1 in gold for this dollar bill. So Cleveland was an Eastern gold guy. Now, when he was running in 1892, he needed to win the South and the West, and so he added to his ticket. Actually, he didn't add. The party bosses added to the ticket Adlai Stevenson. So this Adlai Stevenson was the grandfather of Adlai Stevenson, who was the Democratic presidential candidate in 52 and 56. But Adlai Stevenson was a silver guy. He was from Illinois, and he was very pro-silver. So you had this weird situation where the president and the vice president were on opposite sides of one of the most contentious issues. I say today it would almost be like having a a pro-life president and a pro-choice vice president. I mean,
it wouldn't make much sense, but somehow
it,
it happened.
right. And at that time, the parties themselves had sort of conservative and liberal wings, right? So you would have conservative Democrats and liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans and liberal Republicans. It wasn't quite the same like, the parties weren't exactly one on one side, one on the other. Within the parties, there was a lot of variation. So Cleveland added, or Adlai Stevenson was added to the ticket with Cleveland in 1892. They win, go back to Washington. Cleveland gets diagnosed with this cancer. It's on the roof of his mouth. He decides to have the operation on a boat. Friend had a boat, so they were going to do it there. Stevenson, who was never really close with Cleveland. I mean, I think they had a professional relationship, but they weren't going fishing together. Stevenson got wind of this. Cleveland did not want Stevenson to know. He didn't want anybody to know he was sick outside his family. He was afraid that it would be bad for the economy. The stock market had just crashed. The Panic of 1893 had just begun. Cleveland was afraid that if Wall Street found out he was sick, that he was the only thing standing between Stevenson becoming president, who would be a silver guy, et cetera, et cetera. So Cleveland, for better or worse, decides to keep it secret, especially from Stevenson. So Stevenson heard rumors that Cleveland was not well. And Stevenson at the time was in Chicago, and he sent a telegram to Cleveland and saying, "Mr. President, I'm coming back to Washington as soon as I can." And Cleveland replied with a telegram that said, "Well, actually, Adlai, what I'd like you to do is go out to Seattle and give a couple speeches." And so in 1893, the trip from Chicago to Seattle was much more arduous than it is today. And that basically put Adlai Stevenson out of the loop for weeks, if not months. And that was how Grover kept Adlai Stevenson out of the situation. So he never found out about the operation.
So interesting. It always reminds me of the in the movie Dave, when they're like, well, we got to make sure the president looks healthy. What do? Let's send the vice president somewhere far away so they can't mess anything up. It's,
Yeah, exactly.
And trying to explain to people, because they don't always understand that the vice presidency is not what it is today, with Joe Biden constantly being there, advising President Obama, Dick Cheney having the amount of influence he did over George W. Bush. The vice president was insignificant. They mattered when it came to a tie-breaking vote.
Yep.
And most of the time, they didn't even meet their vice president till after the election, or maybe they knew them in a previous Senate career, but it's always interesting.
I think that was the situation with Cleveland. I'm not sure Cleveland met Stevenson before the inauguration. Cleveland, I don't believe, attended at the time, presidents didn't go to their conventions. It was a little unseemly to be seen as campaigning for the nomination. So you stayed at home and had all your friends. Yeah. Can't pretend, can't show that you really want to be president. So their friends would go lobby for them and stuff like that. So yeah, so Cleveland, I believe he didn't attend that convention in 92. And so there's, I think it's likely he didn't meet Stevenson until after they became president and vice president.
And I do know part of the reason too is that Cleveland never liked campaigning. He didn't like having to deal with the press. And then in 1892, though Benjamin Harrison's wife was getting sick, he's like, well, I don't want to go out, break this norm that I already don't want to break, and then do it while the current president's wife is sick. He's like, that's just me.
Yeah. It was really interesting because the 1884 campaign, when Grover won, and that was the one where it came out he fathered the illegitimate child, and James Blaine was the Republican nominee. That was just one of the most bitter elections in American history. But the election in 92 and 88 was pretty contentious, the first Harrison Cleveland, but that election in 92, you're right. I think her name was Catherine. Benjamin Harrison's wife actually died just about 6 or 8 weeks before Election Day.
I think it was actually about 2, because it was October 25th.
Oh, okay.
And then,
okay, yeah. And she had been sick for a very long time.
Tuberculosis, sadly.
Yeah. And so Benjamin Harrison basically stopped campaigning to care for his wife. And when he did that, Grover said, well, I'm not going to campaign either. And so it was really one of the most quiet presidential campaigns in American history. And you're right, Grover was not the walk into the crowd and shake everybody's hand kind of guy. He wasn't the backslapper. That wasn't, I think he was kind of in a way an introvert. He almost reminds me of Nixon sometimes in the way that like politics almost didn't suit his personality. I think when you hung out with him and spent time and he was your friend and he was very gregarious, like I said, and outgoing, but like he didn't like that part of it, the public facing part of it, which was another reason he wanted to keep the cancer secret. Now, Grant had died, I think it was 87. It was in Grover's first term that Grant died, and he had an oral cancer, and it was a whole spectacle, this death watch, and the reporters out in front of Grant's townhouse and all that. And so Cleveland had seen all that close up, and he had no desire to be the focus of attention like that. So that was another reason he wanted to keep it secret.
Yeah. And that's, Cleveland is just, again, for so many reasons, such an interesting figure, because I never got the sense that Cleveland and Harrison just hated each other. They always seemed very respectful. I always like to go back to that image of Cleveland holding the umbrella for Harrison at his inauguration, and then not campaigning. You really just wouldn't see those sorts of gestures today. And I think we can learn a lesson from them. But okay, sometimes we can, like, if you are having to resort to sort of ad hominem, well, maybe just look back to some of the past elections. Not all of them, because some of them were obviously contentious.
Right.
But it's always fascinating to see how things have changed, because for us, the norm is elections last forever now. I swear we've been in the 2022 midterm since 1905.
Since the day after election day. Yeah.
Yes.
2020. Yeah. Yeah. Really, back then it was sort of like, I guess it was Labor Day, like the end of summer, like in September, you would start the campaign for president. So really it was only 2 months. September and October were the 2 months that you campaigned, and then the elections in early November, and that's it. So yeah, it is kind of nice that how it had a much more compressed time schedule back then.
So, and another thing that you kind of mentioned was when Grant got diagnosed with his cancer. Tell us a little bit more about that, because you call it in the book, they say it was the dread disease because there was just nothing they could do about it.
Yeah, that was another reason that Cleveland wanted to keep it secret, because at that time, if you were diagnosed with cancer, it was basically considered a death sentence. There was no cure for cancer. There still is no cure for cancer, but there was also no viable treatment for cancer at the time. Really nothing the doctors could do. They could perform surgery to remove the tumor, but that was pretty much the extent of it. And so, so when Grant got cancer and then, of course, rather swiftly died, it just sort of reinforced in people's minds this perception that cancer was, as you said, the dread disease, the disease that no doctor dare name. They wouldn't use the word in the newspapers, things like that. So to be diagnosed with cancer was just considered a death sentence. So another reason that Cleveland didn't want people to know he had it.
And then when Cleveland finally does get the surgery, most people would think, 1890s, terrible medicine, terrible doctors who they don't follow germ theory in the States. But, people are mainly kind of looking back to, James Garfield, and they think about his doctors who were just incompetent. But in that 12 years, there was such a leap.
There was. Yeah, there was. And Cleveland, Cleveland had the advantage. Garfield got shot, and then the doctors sort of picked Garfield. Garfield was in no shape to decide who was going to treat him. Cleveland had the benefit of being able to decide who his doctors would be. And so his family doctor was this guy, Joseph D. Bryant in New York. And then he knew all the best doctors in America. So Bryant sort of put this team together, and kind of the leader of the team was W.W. Keene, who was a doctor from Philadelphia. And Keene was very much up on the latest in germ theory, in surgical techniques. The instruments he had were really state of the art. And so the operation itself, they had to use ether as the anesthesia, but they had anesthesia too. He was anesthetized, and they performed the operation on this boat, but very quickly. It was only about, I think, 90 minutes, and they took out most of the upper left palate where this tumor was. And it was interesting because I went to Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, and I talked to one of the head of oncology there, who does the cancer surgeries, and he was very impressed at this. He's like, an operation like that today would take several hours, but that they had done it as quickly as they did. But really, in a way, it did harken back to sort of the medieval idea of like, get it done as quick as you can. This was a holdover from the days before anesthesia, when an operation, the goal was to do it fast. The best doctors were fast. And I think that was still kind of the mindset in the 1890s. But he had very good medical care. And hey, look, the results speak for themselves. There was no recurrence of the cancer. They were able to fit him with a prosthetic device that he put up in his mouth that restored the shape of his face and his speaking voice. And really, by the operation was July 1st. And by September, he was back in Washington, and nobody could tell the difference.
And that's a remarkable recovery, because they had the disadvantage of having to do it all inside his mouth, because he didn't want any external scarring, as you point out. Because it'd be pretty obvious to know if a guy with a really distinctive mustache just suddenly loses it.
Right. Wanted to keep the mustache and didn't want any external scars, because, of course, if you got a big scar on your face, a bunch of stitches like holding your cheek together, you have to do some explaining. So they were able to do it entirely within the mouth, no external incisions required. And that was very important for keeping the whole thing secret.
And again, Cleveland is just so lucky, because if you think 8 years later, President McKinley gets shot and dies from an infection of gangrene. So Cleveland really did have just probably the best medical team he could have found. They were all like up to date. They knew what they were doing. You
never would have expected, Grover Cleveland to outlive McKinley.
Exactly.
He did by a good bit, but you're right. But again, Cleveland was able to kind of set the terms of his healthcare, which isn't always great when the patient's in charge. I mean, that's one of the problems when the president is the patient. They sort of set the terms of the treatment. But in this case, it worked out pretty good for Grover.
It's always hard when you're operating. I think it's the movie Dirt, when they're in the ambulance and he was like, I'm not letting a superstar die in my ambulance. He gives him 2 shots of adrenaline. It's that sort of idea. Like, I don't want to be the guy, because they'll blame me.
Right. Exactly. Keene talks about it. Keene finally, it was kept secret until Keene, who lived to be a very old man. I mean, he lived into his 90s. Keene, in fact, was a Civil War. He was an officer in the Civil War and the First World War. On the First World War is kind of an honorary thing, but in 1917, he published an account of the operation. He says in there, one of the things was, we were terrified that if anything went wrong, we were all, what's the saying, up to the hub in mud, I think was what they would say if you were in deep, what. So he knew, they were all very well aware that it would be have a negative impact on their, personal and professional lives if anything happened to Cleveland.
So again, always just such a fascinating story to learn about these things, because if we found out today that Joe Biden had gone for an operation, and Kamala Harris heard whispers, and he said, no, you go off into far off Canada and somewhere, and to stay away. And we found out about that, the cries for impeachment would be immediate.
Yes. It would be very, very difficult to do today. Now, I think there is a small operating theater on Air Force One. So theoretically, Cleveland also had the advantage back then that, he did this. The cover story was, I'm going up to Buzzards Bay, which is up on the coast of Massachusetts. I'm going up there to do some fishing. He had a summer home there. I'm going to go on my friend's boat. He got on the boat. They did the operation on the way up there. And then he basically stayed up there for 2 months, because at that time, everybody left Washington in the summer.
Yes.
It wasn't unusual for the president just to go away for 2 months in the summer. A lot of presidents did it. because everybody went away from Washington. It was miserable in the summer. Nobody wanted to be there for air conditioning. It was miserable. So he had that advantage that he could just sort of disappear for a couple of months. And, he had a spokesperson who would go out and give updates to the reporters. This is what the president did today. And then there were rumors that there'd been an operation. He said, oh, well, he had a couple of teeth extracted. That's all. So it would be so much harder to do today to like just disappear for, if the president when Cleveland did this in 1893, the operation was July 1st, but they didn't get to Buzzards Bay, I think, until the 5th. So on the 4th of July in 1893, nobody knew where the president was.
Yeah.
It wouldn't happen today.
If no one sees the president for 2 hours today, they're starting to think like, right. Where is he? Where were they?
All the conspiracy theories would begin.
So now we are starting to reach up on our time limit here. So I want to give you the stage. Is there anything you want to shout out? Any social medias? Any new project you've got coming up? To, just go ahead.
All right. Well, I'm working on a book that is. I'm supposed to get it done by the end of the year. I hope I do. It's a Harry Truman book. This one is called When Harry Met Pablo, Modern Art, McCarthyism, and the Day Truman and Picasso Went Sightseeing. So Truman and Picasso ended up spending a day together in the south of France in 1958 when Truman went on a vacation there. It was really done, it was kind of orchestrated as a signal, a show of support for modern art against the right-wing Republicans in Congress at the time, who were very anti-modern art. So it's kind of about modern art and the Red Scare in the 1950s and McCarthyism and all that. But please, anybody who's interested, go pick up the Grover Cleveland book, The President is a Sick Man. It's really, like I said, it was a huge gap in my knowledge of U.S. history, that period between the Civil War and the First World War. And like we were talking about, so much interesting stuff going on there. And you just, so much to learn from that period of history.
So, all right, everyone. Thank you all for tuning into this. Have a great day and enjoy.